From Prison to Freedom. The Tearful Journey of American Homosexuals. The handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus Williams' wrists on a Tuesday morning in 1953, but the real chains had been binding him his entire life. The police officer shoved him into the patrol car with a sneer that spoke volumes about what he thought of men like Marcus, men who dared to love other men in a world that called such love a crime. Marcus had been caught in what the newspapers would later describe as a raid on a known homosexual establishment, though to him it had simply been the Stonewall Inn, the only place in New York City where he could hold hands with Daniel without fear of judgment. Now Daniel was gone, disappeared into the crowd of fleeing men when the police burst through the doors with their clubs and their hatred. The cell door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through Marcus' soul. He was 24 years old, a college graduate with dreams of becoming a teacher. But those dreams now seemed as distant as the stars he could barely see through the tiny barred window. His cellmate, an older man named Frank, had been there for 3 days already, his face bearing the purple bruises of what he quietly called his welcome to justice. Frank had been a minister, once he told Marcus in whispered conversations, after the guards had finished their evening rounds. He had served a congregation in Alabama for 15 years, had married couples and baptized babies and delivered sermons about love and redemption, all while hiding the truth about who he was and who he loved. The day they found him with another man was the day his world collapsed completely. The prison was a special kind of hell for men like them. The other inmates knew why they were there, could smell the difference on them like predators, sensing wounded prey. Marcus learned to keep his eyes down and his mouth shut, to eat quickly and sleep lightly, to disappear into himself so completely that sometimes even he forgot who he was. Years passed like seasons of suffering. Marcus was released after 18 months, but Frank remained behind his sentence longer because he had been caught before. On the day Marcus walked free, Frank pressed a small piece of paper into his hand, an address in San Francisco, where he said there were others like them, others who refused to let the world break them completely. The address led to a small bookstore in the Castro district where a woman named Barbara sold poetry and hope in equal measure. She looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen too much pain but refused to surrender to despair, and she told him about the others who gathered in the back room on Thursday nights to share stories and strength. That first Thursday, Marcus sat in a circle with 12 other men and women who had survived their own versions of hell. There was Robert, a doctor, who had lost his practice when his relationship with another man became public knowledge. There was Sarah, who had been disowned by her family for loving women, and had spent 2 years living on the streets before finding her way to Barbara's store. They called themselves the Circle of Truth, and in that small room behind the bookstore, they began to heal the wounds that society had carved into their souls. They shared stories of love found and lost, of families who turned their backs, and friends who disappeared, of jobs lost and dreams deferred, but also of small victories and moments of joy that kept them alive. Marcus found work in a factory, hiding his truth from his co-workers, but no longer hiding it from himself. He rented a small apartment 3 blocks from the bookstore and began to build a life that felt like his own for the first time since childhood. He wrote letters to Frank in prison, long letters full of hope and news from the outside world, and Frank wrote back with words of encouragement and wisdom earned through suffering. One Thursday night in 1965, a young man named David walked into the Circle of Truth with tears streaming down his face and terror in his eyes. He was 17 years old and had been thrown out of his family home in Ohio after his father found love letters from another boy. He had hitchhiked to San Francisco with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of desperation. Marcus looked at David and saw himself 12 years earlier broken and afraid, and convinced that he was alone in the world. He took David home that night, gave him a place to sleep and food to eat, and slowly began to show him that love was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated. David became the son Marcus never thought he would have, and Marcus became the father David needed after his own had rejected him so completely. They lived together for 3 years, and Marcus watched as David transformed from a frightened boy into a confident young man who refused to apologize for who he was. In 1968, Frank was finally released from prison, a broken man of 62 who had served 15 years for the crime of loving another human being. Marcus met him at the prison gates, and they embraced with tears that had been building for more than a decade. Frank moved in with Marcus and David, and slowly began to remember what it felt like to be human again. The world outside was changing slowly but surely. The Stonewall riots in 1969 marked a turning point that Marcus could never have imagined when he was first arrested 16 years earlier. Young people were refusing to hide, were demanding their rights and their dignity, were fighting back against the system that had tried to crush them. Marcus was 40 years old by then, old enough to remember when such defiance would have been unthinkable, but young enough to join the fight. He marched in the first Pride Parade in San Francisco, walking hand in hand with Frank and David, tears streaming down his face as he realized that they were no longer alone. The years that followed brought changes that seemed miraculous to those who remembered the darkness. Laws began to change slowly at first, and then, with gathering momentum, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders in 1973, a victory that felt like vindication for all who had been told they were sick and broken. Marcus met Jonathan in 1974 at a community center fundraiser. Jonathan was 35, a lawyer who had devoted his career to fighting discrimination against gay men and women. He had kind eyes and gentle hands, and when he smiled at Marcus across the crowded room, Marcus felt something he had not experienced in 20 years, the possibility of love without fear. Their courtship was careful and tentative. Two men who had learned to guard their hearts, but were slowly learning to open them again. Jonathan had his own scars, his own stories of rejection and pain, but he also had hope and determination, and a belief that their love could help heal the world. They moved in together after 6 months, creating a home filled with books and music and laughter. Frank and David had moved into their own apartment nearby, but they remained close, a chosen family bound together by shared experience and unconditional love. Marcus returned to his dream of teaching, enrolling in graduate school at 42 to earn the credentials he needed. The world had changed enough that he could be open about who he was, could speak honestly about his life and his love without fear of losing everything. His first teaching position was at a high school in Oakland, where he taught American history to teenagers who knew nothing about the struggles of people like him. He began to incorporate those stories into his lessons carefully at first, but with growing confidence as he saw how his students responded. One day, a 16-year-old boy named Michael stayed after class, his hands shaking as he struggled to find the words for what he needed to say. He was gay, he whispered, and he was terrified that his parents would find out. Marcus looked at this frightened boy and saw David, saw himself, saw all the young people who had suffered in silence for so long. He spent hours with Michael sharing his story and connecting him with resources and support. Michael's parents were difficult at first, but Marcus met with them repeatedly, helping them understand that their son was the same person he had always been, that love was love, regardless of its form. Michael graduated with honors and went on to college, but he stayed in touch with Marcus, sending letters and then emails about his life and his relationships and his dreams. He was one of hundreds of students that Marcus would mentor over the years, young people who needed to know that they were not alone and that their lives had value. In 1981, the first reports of a mysterious illness affecting gay men began to appear in medical journals. The disease that would become known as AIDS struck the community like a plague, and Marcus watched in horror as friends and loved ones began to disappear. Jonathan was diagnosed in 1983, and Marcus became his caregiver, holding his hand through the long nights and the difficult treatments. The disease ravaged Jonathan's body, but not his spirit, and he continued to practice law from his hospital bed, advocating for patients' rights and research funding until his final breath. Marcus held Jonathan as he died on a cold February morning in 1985, whispering words of love and gratitude for the 11 years they had shared. The grief was overwhelming, a pain that seemed to tear through his chest and leave him gasping for air. Frank was there as he had been through every crisis and celebration. He was 79 years old, then frail but determined, and he held Marcus as he wept for the man he had loved and lost. David was there too, now a successful architect with a partner of his own, providing strength and support when Marcus felt too broken to continue. The AIDS crisis brought out both the worst and the best in humanity. Marcus witnessed hatred and ignorance that rivaled what he had experienced in the 1950s. But he also saw compassion and courage that gave him hope for the future. He volunteered at the local AIDS hospice, holding the hands of dying men who had been abandoned by their families, being present for those who had no one else. Barbara from the bookstore died in 1987, not from AIDS, but from cancer, and Marcus delivered the eulogy at her memorial service. He spoke about her courage and her kindness, about the sanctuary she had created for lost souls seeking refuge from a hostile world. The bookstore continued under new management, but it was never quite the same without her fierce presence. Frank died peacefully in his sleep in 1989 at the age of 85. He had lived to see changes that he could never have imagined when he was first imprisoned for loving another man. Marcus found a letter among his belongings addressed to him and filled with gratitude for their friendship and hope for the future. The 1990s brought new challenges and new victories. Marcus continued to teach, now openly gay and proudly so, inspiring young people to embrace their authentic selves. He testified before the state legislature about anti-discrimination laws, sharing his story of arrest and imprisonment with lawmakers who had the power to ensure that such injustices would never happen again. In 1993, he was invited to speak at the March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi-equal rights and liberation. Standing before a crowd of nearly 1 million people, Marcus thought about the frightened young man who had been arrested 40 years earlier, who could never have imagined such a day would come. He spoke about Frank and Barbara and Jonathan, about the friends who had not lived to see this celebration of love and freedom. He spoke about the young people who were growing up in a world where they could be themselves, without fear, where their love was recognized and valued and protected by law. David stood in the crowd with his partner Marcus, whom he had named after his adoptive father. They had been together for 8 years and were planning to have a commitment ceremony, the closest thing to marriage that was available to them at the time. Marcus looked at them and felt a surge of joy that nearly overwhelmed him. The ceremony took place in Marcus's backyard the following summer, with 40 friends and family members in attendance. Marcus performed the ritual, having been ordained online for the occasion, and he spoke about love conquering fear and hope, triumphing over despair. As the new millennium approached, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey he had witnessed and participated in. The world had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1953, when loving another man was a crime punishable by imprisonment and shame. He retired from teaching in 2000 at the age of 71, but he continued to volunteer and advocate and share his story with anyone who would listen. He spoke at universities and community centers, at churches and synagogues and mosques, building bridges between communities that had been divided by fear and misunderstanding. In 2003, the Supreme Court struck down laws criminalizing same-sex relationships in Lawrenceville, Texas, finally overturning the legal framework that had sent Marcus to prison 50 years earlier. He watched the news coverage with tears streaming down his face, thinking about all the men and women who had suffered under those unjust laws. 2 years later, Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage, and Marcus flew to Boston to witness the historic moment. He stood outside the courthouse as couples emerged with their marriage certificates, some of them elderly like himself, finally able to legally recognize relationships that had lasted for decades. David and his partner Marcus were among the first couples to marry in California, when it briefly became legal in 2008. Marcus Sr. walked David down the aisle, his heart full of pride and joy for the young man who had become his son in every way that mattered. The marriage was invalidated months later, when Proposition 8 passed, but the memory of that day sustained them through the legal battles that followed. Marcus testified in the federal court case that ultimately overturned the proposition, his voice strong and clear as he spoke about the dignity and worth of same-sex relationships. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, and 2 years later, it ruled in Obergefell v. Hodges that same-sex marriage was a constitutional right in all 50 states. Marcus was 86 years old when he watched the decision announced on television, and he wept with joy at the thought that young people would never again face the legal discrimination that had defined his early life. He lived to see openly gay people serve in Congress and on the Supreme Court, to see transgender people fight for their rights and recognition, to see a world where love truly was love, regardless of its form. The journey had been long and painful, marked by loss and suffering that sometimes seemed unbearable, but it had led to freedom and dignity and hope. David and Marcus Jr. adopted a daughter in 2010, a baby girl they named Barbara, in honor of the woman who had provided sanctuary for so many lost souls. Marcus Sr. held his granddaughter in his arms and told her stories about the brave people who had fought for her right to grow up in a world where love was celebrated rather than criminalized. He died peacefully in his sleep in 2018 at the age of 89, surrounded by the family he had chosen and the community he had helped to build. His memorial service was held in the same church where Frank had once been a minister, and hundreds of people came to honor a man who had survived persecution and lived to see liberation. David spoke at the service about the father who had saved his life and taught him to be proud of who he was. Marcus Jr. spoke about the grandfather who had shown him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Barbara Jr., now 2 years old, toddled around the church bringing smiles to faces streaked with tears. The pastor who conducted the service was a young gay man named Thomas, who had been inspired by Marcus's story to enter the ministry. He spoke about redemption and resurrection, about the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful. After the service, people gathered in the church hall to share memories and stories. There were former students who credited Marcus with saving their lives, young activists who had been inspired by his courage, colleagues who had witnessed his dedication to justice and equality. An elderly woman named Ruth approached David with tears in her eyes. She had been Barbara's partner for 30 years. She explained, though they had never been able to legally marry before Barbara's death, she wanted to thank Marcus for creating a space where their love had been honored and celebrated, even when the law did not recognize it. David hugged her tightly and promised that Marcus's legacy would continue through the foundation they were establishing in his name. The Marcus Williams Foundation would provide scholarships for LGBTQ students, support for homeless youth, and funding for organizations working to advance equality and acceptance. 6 months after Marcus's death, David received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a worn journal that Marcus had kept during his time in prison, pages filled with his thoughts and dreams and determination to survive. The final entry, dated the day before his release, contained these words: "I do not know what the future holds, but I know that love will find a way to triumph over hate, that truth will overcome lies, that freedom will defeat oppression. I have seen the darkness, but I believe in the light." David read those words aloud at the Foundation's first fundraising gala, and there was not a dry eye in the room. The audience included survivors of the early gay rights movement, young activists carrying the torch forward, and allies who understood that the struggle for equality was far from over. A young transgender woman named Alex spoke about the challenges her community still faced, the discrimination and violence that continued to plague LGBTQ people around the world. But she also spoke about hope, about the progress that had been made, and the work that remained to be done. The gala raised over $1 million for the Foundation's programs, but more importantly, it brought together a community that had been forged in struggle and strengthened by solidarity. Marcus would have been proud to see the seeds he had planted growing into a forest of acceptance and love. As the evening ended, David stood on the stage looking out at the crowd of people who had come to honor his father's memory. He thought about the journey from prison to freedom, about the tears and the triumph, about the long road that had led to this moment of celebration. The fight was not over, he knew. There were still states where LGBTQ people faced discrimination, still countries where loving someone of the same gender was punishable by death. But the foundation Marcus had helped to build would continue to grow, would continue to fight, would continue to spread the message that love was stronger than hate. In the years that followed, the Marcus Williams Foundation touched thousands of lives. Young people who might otherwise have faced homelessness found shelter and support. Students who dreamed of college despite financial hardship received scholarships that opened doors to brighter futures. Organizations working to change hearts and minds received funding that amplified their voices and expanded their reach. David often thought about the conversation he had with Marcus shortly before his death, when the old man had reflected on his life and legacy. "I never imagined that a boy from Ohio who was arrested for loving another man would live to see marriage equality," Marcus had said. "But I learned that progress comes not from those in power, but from those who refuse to accept injustice, who stand up and speak out even when their voices shake with fear." Those words became the Foundation's motto, inscribed on a plaque in the lobby of their headquarters in San Francisco. Visitors often stopped to read them, drawing inspiration from the story of a man who had transformed his pain into purpose, his suffering into service. 10 years after Marcus's death, David stood before the Supreme Court as it heard arguments in a case that would determine whether discrimination against LGBTQ people in employment was constitutional. He carried with him a photo of Marcus and Frank taken at that first Pride Parade in 1970, two men who had survived society's cruelest judgments and lived to march in celebration of their love. The court ruled in favor of equality, and David called Marcus Jr. with the news. His son was now a civil rights lawyer himself, following in the footsteps of the grandfather who had raised him. Barbara Jr. was in high school, a confident young woman who served as president of her school's Gay-Straight Alliance and volunteered at the local LGBTQ community center. 3 generations of a chosen family, each one building on the foundation laid by the man who had refused to let prison walls contain his spirit, or society's hatred diminish his capacity for love. The journey from prison to freedom had been long and difficult, marked by loss and pain that sometimes seemed unbearable. But it had also been illuminated by moments of grace and joy, by the simple recognition that love was indeed love regardless of its form. As David walked down the courthouse steps, he could almost hear Marcus's voice carried on the wind, speaking words of encouragement to the young people who would carry the torch forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The boy who had been arrested in 1953 for the crime of loving another man had become a symbol of resilience and hope, proof that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. The tears that had marked so much of this journey had been tears of pain and grief, but they had also been tears of joy and triumph. Each drop had watered the seeds of change, nurturing a movement that had transformed not just laws, but hearts, not just policies, but people. From prison to freedom, from shame to pride, from isolation to community, the journey continued. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, Marcus Williams smiled, knowing that love had indeed found a way to triumph over hate, that truth had overcome lies, that freedom had defeated oppression. The story was far from over, but this chapter had ended with the promise of new beginnings, with the certainty that the long arc of justice would continue to bend toward equality and acceptance. The tearful journey of American homosexuals had become a testament to the power of the human spirit, to endure, to overcome, and ultimately to prevail.